win engagements.
That was earlier on, and our reporter Ian Kitani is currently following up on the developments playing out at the Africa Forward Summit at KICC Nairobi, and he joins us live for an update on the latest ongoing debates over global financial reforms and Africa's push for greater representation in international institutions. Ian Kitani, good afternoon. How are you doing, and what's the latest from where you are?
Well, good afternoon. Like you've rightly put it, I am at the KICC where this particular summit is happening. And remember, this is the first Africa Forward Summit in over 5 decades that is being held outside France or French-speaking countries, famously known as the Francophone countries. And this, many say, is a bid by the French government trying to recalibrate its foreign policy following what is happening in the West African region. Remember, there are the Sahel states that, coups did happen. And this is something that many argue is pushing the French government to try and recalibrate its foreign policy and look elsewhere. And this being an opportunity for the French government, led by President Emmanuel Macron, trying to solidify its base or make new friends in East Africa. And the coups that happened in West Africa, that being in countries like Burkina Faso, Mali and Guinea, these Sahel states, was something that President William Ruto talked about this particular morning during the plenary session that happened in the morning. The head of state saying that for the continent to move forward together, and then there is need for peace and stability. And in his own words, he said that the unconstitutional change of governments, that referring to the coups, is not something that Africa should be, doing, and that, he says, is hurting the continent. Remember, that happened, like I said, in the Sahel state, which, by the way, are not represented here. But we have other French-speaking countries that are rather attending this particular summit, the likes of Ivory Coast, Senegal, and other West African countries in attendance for this, or rather, in this particular summit. Now, President William Ruto has alluded to many things, top among them the financial architecture. He has attributed to infrastructure development. He has also attributed to issues relating to the energy sector. And the president has called for, of course, the recalibration of the financial architecture, which he says does not favor Africa. And there's need for Africa to champion for a financial architecture that will ensure the continent moves forward in one direction. And in fact, he says Africa must increasingly finance Africa. And that is why he says they're championing for the Africa Credit Rating Agency, which he says will ensure a fairer and financial architecture that will help Africa advance its agenda. Now, this is something that was also touched on by the United Nations Secretary General, that is Antonio Guterres, who talked about matters financial aid cuts. We saw that happen when President Donald Trump took over office in the United States, and that, Antonio Guterres said, did really hurt Africa. And they also talked about the issue of, African countries and the African continent at large being included in the UN Security Council, saying that a continent of about 1.5 billion people, lacking representation. And like you can see right now, that is the president of Nigeria, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, leaving this particular venue, because after the plenary session in the morning, we saw, the heads of state head into closed-door panel sessions. And of course, the president of Nigeria is also accompanied by billionaire businessman Aliko Dangote. We've seen very many heads of state here, including the presidents of Senegal, Niger. We've seen the president of Madagascar. Most African countries, they're represented here by their heads of state. But just back to what I was talking about, the issue of Africa being represented in the UN Security Council. President William Ruto, as well as UN Secretary General, that is Antonio Guterres, making their point across that Africa needs to be represented. And like I alluded to, a continent of 1.5 billion people, according to Antonio Guterres, cannot lack representation in the United Nations Security Council. Now, President Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, talked about, the deliberations and that will be made in this particular summit being taken or presented before the G20 summit, which will be happening in France later on this year. And he alluded to him being among the people who are championed for the inclusion of the African continent in the G20. Now, the issue of climate change also popped up in this particular summit. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres also talking about how Africa needs to be at the center of the conversation in regards to matters climate change conservations. And again, just to go a little back to what the head of state, President William Ruto, talked about, and he said, in regards to matters infrastructure development, that is in regards to matters transport, he alluded to there being a need for Africa to prioritize transport infrastructure, be it rail, be it road, or be it air transport. And he says Africa cannot achieve its set targets, its ambitions and aspirations without a proper infrastructure development. And he says we cannot move forward if we are not connected. So those are just some of the issues that arose during the plenary session this particular morning. But the most important thing, and in President William Ruto's 30 minutes or 45 minutes thereabout address, he mostly focused on the issue of financial architecture and the need for Africa to consolidate itself, come together and ensure that they can be able to also finance the continent by themselves and, of course, reduce over-reliance on others. And he said, of course, the recalibrating of Africa's space on the global stage is a bit important, and he said outdated models of aid towards a framework anchored on industrialization and mutual beneficial cooperation. And that is what President Emmanuel Macron talked about, saying that there is need for proper cooperation between the French government and the African continent as the continent seeks to achieve its agenda. And of course, again, the president alluded to issues of domestic capital, which he says remained underutilized, and saying that Africa's development projects remain starved of finances. And I say that is why Kenya and the African continent is very, very keen on a resilient financial architecture that will support African ambitions. And there is, no need for fragmented institutions. So those are just some of the key highlights that we heard from the speakers in the plenary session this particular morning. And we, of course, continue to follow up on these discussions right here at the KICC. This being a very momentous occasion for Nairobi and Kenya in general, as it tries to position itself as a global city or capital in the world. So, of course, we'll be keeping tabs with whatever will happen later on in the afternoon sessions right here at the KICC. We expect there will be deliberations on matters climate change in terms of the panel discussions, matters energy, and also, again, most importantly, the issue of financing Africa and the financial architecture. So that is what happened in the morning session right here at the KICC. For now, I'll hand it over back to you.
All right, thanks for that.